Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? Grandma didn't decide to move in with us because she loved us so much and wanted to spend more time with us. Grandma moved in because her son was a meth addict and convinced her to put his name on the house, take all the money out of it for renovations, and leave her homeless. She had a heart attack the night she found out and now has to live with a pacemaker. F you, Uncle Roy. My cousins lived with us for a while, and we thought that was fun because it's like a sleepover every day. One time our mom even took us out of school to pick them up. I learned later that it was because Child Protective Services took my cousins away from their mom because of mental health issues. My mom offered to take her sister's kids until she got her mental health back in order. My cousins live with their mom now, and their mom is in a much better condition mentally. My grandma retired, and she still decided to work for her brother in his restaurant to save up money for when she dies. Funerals are obviously expensive. She insisted he would hold on to her paychecks and pay for her funeral when she dies. He never did. I think this is the shittiest one to actually exploit your elderly sister that way. I don't know why, but this is not the worst, but it's horrible to me because it's callous and a decision purely based on greed. It pushes aside what should have been decades of familial love for, what, $10,000 to $20,000? That's it? The price of a new car? It's low, shameful, and slimy. To me, this is the worst story on here. My heart sinks, and I mourn for that man's parents when I read about this, and hope they never got a chance to hear about how their son acted towards his sister. What a fucking asshole. How did the funeral end up being paid for? I think another family member paid for it, and the spot on a cemetery has to be paid for after the first 10 years for another decade. My mom was trying to sue her uncle to pay for it, but they only had a verbal agreement about the funeral, so it wasn't successful. My father got my mother pregnant when he was her teacher in high school. He was 30 and married. She was 15 and his student. They ran off together. He got a divorce, and they got married in a state that allowed marriage at 16, 2 months before my older brother was born. Wow, may I ask if your parents still have connections with their families? There was a feud that got bloody for a while, as my father's nephews, my cousins, fought with my mother's brothers, my uncles, regularly. They went to the same high school. My mother's father went after my dad with a shotgun, but couldn't find him. It all eventually blew over, but there was always bad blood. All 4 of my grandparents are dead now. Just a side note, my parents were married for almost 25 years, and I'm the middle of 3 sons. I didn't find out most of this until I was 18. My mother is now 60 and my father is 74. I've never met that first wife or even seen a picture. He's on his 4th marriage and she's on her 2nd. My dad's uncle died in a boating accident with his cousins. My family let me know he was possibly drowned in the middle of the lake by his cousins because of some money issues. No one was ever prosecuted though, and the family is still very close. Weird. I'm still at least one family secret. I'm adopted and found my biological father. He begged me not to reach out to any of my half-siblings as it would ruin his life and standing in the community. The sad thing is, I'm not even his first secret child. I have an older half-sister that he also begged not to reach out to family. So that's 2 kids he's had because he cheated on his wife. I can only imagine how often he cheats to have at least 2 women end up pregnant. My half-sister and I call 23, and me, how we met, 23 and Mark, because who knows how many more kids he might have out there. Pretty sure he's been terrified since at home. DNA kits became a thing. Second edit and additional info. First, I can finally say it, RIP my inbox. I tried to answer as many of you as I could, but I thought I'd clear up some of the most repeated questions here. Why don't I tell his wife? I don't need to. She already knew about my half-sister and now me because she answered his phone when I first called asking questions and promptly told me to leave her family the hell alone. Screw him asking me to stay quiet. Why don't I blow up his life, reach out to my half-siblings? It is largely because of my half-siblings that I haven't done anything. I did not sign up to be a wrecking ball or to destroy a family. Imagine finding out everything you knew about your dad was a lie in the worst way possible. I know I'd be devastated. I may not have met them, but they are my half-siblings. They are just as innocent in this as I am. I don't want to be the one to hurt them like that. I really hope that he will realize he can't keep a secret like this forever and come clean himself. Why not mail his kids' DNA kits anonymously? Realistically, it's only a matter of time before one of them gets curious and does it on their own or gets gifted one from an unwitting family member, or friend. Why don't I blackmail, extort the bastard? He's a terrible person. He should pay. It's pretty simple. That's just not the kind of person I am. I don't want his money. I never have. I go to bed every night with a clear conscience, which is more than I can say for him, and that's worth more than anything money could buy in my opinion. I have a roof over my head, a husband who loves me, a beautiful daughter, a great dad, and 2 new half-siblings I adore. From my perspective, I'm already rich. My dad never knew his bio dad. He was a war baby, and my grandma refused to talk about his father. After she died, he started asking questions among surviving family members. But everything was so long ago, right after World War II, that he only had a tiny bit of info. I was able to find his bio dad using the info and DNA through Ancestry, but he had passed away a few years ago. We never contacted the guy's family, but there are a whole bunch of people who show up as half-siblings through DNA matches to my father. They're from all over the country and don't show up on bio-grandfather's official family tree. My dad was a bit disappointed. TL.dr tracked down missing grandfather for my dad. Turns out grandfather was very promiscuous and fathering kids and leaving them all over the place. ETA. According to what my dad could gather, they had dated and she got pregnant. He was military and had the opportunity to extend his assignment there, but chose not to. My grandma was extremely hurt by this and refused to talk about it. Apparently, the guy's mom asked for my dad baby to be sent to her to be raised, since my grandma was only around 18 or 19. This means the guy's parents at least knew about my dad. It looks like there are at least 4 other kids born out of wedlock, plus 1 son from marriage. My parents led me to believe that my grandfather, on my mother's side, had died due to a heart attack. A year later, they revealed he actually shot himself in the head. When I was young, I was told my uncle, maternal side, had died suddenly of cancer. I was around 6 years old. My grandfather and another uncle had died within the previous 2 years. So I was, sadly enough for that age, familiar with death and with funerals. It was a closed casket, and when I asked my mom why they didn't open it like they did for the other funerals, she just said that's what his family wanted, and to not mention it anymore. Years later, when I was 12 years old, I was staying at my paternal grandmother's place, and she was going off on some religious rant, as she was apt to do, and the topic of hell came up. My grandma, never one to hold punches, flatly said, "Like your Uncle Charlie, he's in hell, God rest his poor soul." Of course, I asked her what she meant by that, only to have her look at me like I had asked the stupidest question imaginable. Once the shock of my profound ignorance wore off, she simply said, "Well, wiser I, suicide's a one-way ticket to hell, and if shooting yourself in the head isn't suicide, then I don't know what is." That conversation is forever burned into my brain. She was an incredibly warm, caring woman, but she was very matter-of-fact and honest. And she would say some cold-ass shit sometimes due to her insane religious beliefs. She hugged me and baked me cookies afterward and apologized for having to be the one to tell me about how he really died. My grandma actually legally disowned my mother for marrying my dad. The family house was supposed to go to my mom, but after the disowning, Grandma didn't say who she wanted house to go to, resulting in a decades-long family feud that has split the family even to this day. Sad thing is, my parents actually ended up divorced after 20 years of marriage. Mom took care of my grandma till the end and was the one who handled the funeral arrangements when my grandma passed 2 years ago. She never asked for the house back. It's worth millions. Nobody told me any of this until I was 30. Honestly, mad respect to your mom from this post. Did what she wanted, and in the end, even though she was disowned, still came back and took care of her mom. I honestly can't say I do the same. My step-grandfather molested my 3 aunties, my eldest sister, and possibly my other sister and cousin. Only found out when my Nana was dying 11 years after he died. They are buried side by side, and I cannot bring myself to go visit my Nana because he is there also. Edit. Thanks for all the comments about visiting my Nana and ignoring him. I will try. For those saying my Nana had to have known, I have discussed this at length with my auntie, and we are certain she didn't. She worked nights for many, many years, and my aunties all have told each other they would never have told her, as they wanted to protect her. The reason I had a live-in babysitter when I was 5 that moved in at 2 a.m. was because my mom's cousin killed 2 kids, and we ended up harboring his daughter during the trial. He's the only person on death row in my county. That my favorite cousin wasn't missing. All I knew growing up, he was 13 years older than me, was that he would come and go a lot. He lived with us when I was a baby, and after he moved out, he would visit every 6 months or so out of the blue. But we never visited him or called him. His visits were one of my favorite things in the world. I loved him like a brother. By the time I was a teenager, I did understand that he had issues with his parents. They had kicked him out at 13, and my parents took him in. but that kind of childhood messes with you. In between visits to my parents, he avoided the rest of the family, moved a lot, and didn't hold jobs for long, which is why my parents didn't always know where he was. But in my later teens, he stopped coming over at all. I asked repeatedly if anyone had heard from him, and I was told no. I asked about contacting him and was told no one had a number or address for him. He would come around when he felt like it, but it stretched on for years. I really worried he was dead, and I really missed him. In my later 20s, I finally found out that everyone knew where he was the whole time. He was in prison for murder. From what I hear, it was actually somewhat justified. He was defending his new wife, who I never got to meet. I also found out some super shitty things about how the extended family sided with his fucked up parents and refused to help him or his wife when he got arrested, and that they shamed my dad into not helping either. I tried to send a message to him in prison, but I don't know if he ever got it. I wish he knew that I didn't turn my back on him for decades like everyone else did. I just didn't know. Not so much let in on, as we found out by accident, but apparently my dad's first love and him got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father for years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad, even 30 years later. We were always told he was a mentor until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name, and we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with him. My friend was engaged to his first love in their early 20s when she passed from cancer. 10 years later, he got married to an amazing woman who honored his late fiancé in their wedding ceremony. Not a dry eye in the place. Great-grandpa was a soldier opposing the Axis powers. Him and his squad were caught by Italian troops and given the death penalty along with his friends. They would be executed together. At the time of the execution, all of his mates died in front of his eyes. But he survived because the soldier missed. Without skipping a beat, he faked his death by, well, lying on top of his deceased friends' bodies. Surprisingly, it worked and he got to escape. Wow, this must have layers of trauma that goes with it. How sad. Yeah, Grandpa never spoke of it, really. Yeah, I know what you mean. Great uncle was in the French resistance during World War II. Got caught by the Nazi at some point in 1943. Sent to Lyon, interrogated by Klaus Barbie himself, and sent to Mauthausen-Gusen in Austria, from where he fled, got caught, fled again, and got caught again, though later this time. Finally free at the end of the war. I remember thinking it was cool to have a great uncle that was tattooed, until I learned about the camps when I was about 10 or 11. Then, not so cool, but hey, we're proud to have had Resistant in my family, so silver lining. Not exactly a dark secret, he was very open about it, though he would choose what he talked about. When my grandfather died, he wrote his will on his deathbed. He left his entire estate to my family, which was enormous. His wife, however, who despised us, in the biggest f***you move I've ever seen, wrote a directly conflicting will, leaving the estate to her family, none of whom I've ever met, and then killed herself. It took around 5 years in legal hell to sort that out. We ended up winning the case in the end, but it cost so much that we couldn't afford to keep his $3 million house anymore. My grandparents spent some time in lockup after my grandpa killed their newborn in a shell shock-induced frenzy. They were jailed because they buried her body in a cave and tried to hide it. My mom and her siblings were all adopted out very young and went back to their parents around 11 years or so later. I knew that growing up but didn't know why until I was older. That's so terribly sad. A genuine tragedy. I can understand why they wouldn't tell you until you were a little older. I wish in a way they would have told me when I was younger, as I think it would have allowed me to understand my grandma better. She was nice, but extremely detached. Going to hers for a visit was sitting there talking amongst yourselves while she read a romance novel. You could occasionally get a response, but you'd usually have to really pull her away. The only time she wasn't reading was when we would be actively out buying new books for her. This was a monthly outing, weekly for her, but a different aunt's responsibility each week. We'd get her engaged all the way to the store, where she'd buy a book to be completely engrossed in when we went out for lunch. I do get the quiet though. Just wish I could have helped her. She was obviously escaping reality. Not very much a secret, but took me until I was older to understand what was happening. My mom would sometimes have us play a game called Army, which consisted of me, my mom, and my siblings. Army crawling around our apartment, kind of a hide-and-seek style game. She would yell, "Hit the deck," randomly, and we would all drop and find a hiding spot. We would giggle and giggle while my mom Army crawled around looking for us. We loved the game so much. I realized a few years ago, while retelling the story, that we lived in a really terrible neighborhood, and she would yell it out when she heard gunshots outside the building. I'm assuming she was worried about stray bullets. Edit, I shared everyone's amazing comments with my mom, and she shed a tear. She feels very appreciated on International Women's Day today. When I was about 10, my cousin and his dad died. I always thought it was an accident and on the same day. When I was old enough, I was told that his dad actually committed suicide, and my cousin followed him a couple months later. Truly devastated me, although I didn't know them well. Edit. Thank you for the warm words and also for sharing your similar stories with me. I've read all the replies. My grief is still there because I understand that with professional help, both would maybe still be here today. It just wasn't common to seek help back then. I hope all of you are well. My dad's sister had a secret daughter that would have been approximately his age. She was 16 years older than him, and the family didn't tell him until he was in college. In their small town, there is a not zero chance he could date his niece. Edit. For those asking, my dad was 3 to 4 when this happened. He remembers a lot of shouting at the time, but not the topic. Also, he is definitely not the baby in question. Jesus, a 16-year age gap between siblings? I can't imagine basically fully raising a child and then having a brand new one. And then I guess there's the dating your niece thing. My uncle wasn't missing a ton of birthday parties, family reunions, holiday dinners, etc. when I was a kid because of his really busy job, but because he became a heroin addict after his wife took off with their daughter, my cousin, who I've still never met. Edit. Oh yeah, he also tried to stab my aunt, his sister, in a drug-fueled rage when she went off on him about being a bum and exploiting my grandparents' kindness. My grandpa stopped him, but got beaten unconscious in the process. My grandparents' neighbor heard the commotion and had to rush in and stop him at gunpoint. I legit thought he was just a normal, nice guy who I happened to rarely see before I learned all this shit in one night. My step-grandfather has always been an alcoholic. As a child, he even taught me how to mix his favorite drink. As a kid at like 6 years old, I would mix his drink as he liked and bring it into him in the living room. Don't ask what the drink was a mix-off, because I literally can't remember. And my grandpa always acted funny. I always liked spending time with him because I found him funny. So I never saw the bad side of his alcoholism, and he never made me drink or anything. So overall, he didn't have any negative impact on me at all. But before I was born, he could get so drunk he threatened to kill my grandma. And when he got in a car accident and came home, he was bleeding badly from his head. And he started saying, "My granny shot him." He even threw out some of the wedding pictures my parents had. I never knew how horrible he was. Maybe because he liked kids or something. He would make me cocoa and watch Garfield with me when I was a kid. He was never a bad influence in my life, so it was so weird to me when I found out these things about him. Before he died though, he really regretted drinking, and he completely stopped. He became really depressed too until his granddaughter, biological, was born. He was so happy about his granddaughter. He died regretting everything, and a sober man who was happy to have been able to meet his one and only biological granddaughter. Regardless of everything, he really changed in the end, and everyone was really upset he died. My grandmother ran off and had an affair, got pregnant, came back to my grandfather, and they raised the baby girl together. My father and his siblings didn't find out until they were older. I'm not sure if my aunt knew the truth before she passed away. It's also rumored that there's another half-sibling somewhere out there, so Granddad seemed to be having an affair as well. Just affairs all round back in the day. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and all worked to support their families. If they got arrested, they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there, they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 kilometers per hour, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts. And nobody found them or their car for an hour or so. And nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a route and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically, this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. Thank you for watching. Write comments, put likes. Do not forget to watch other videos.